Welcome to the full paper presentation of Loci Stories, Exploring Design for Polyvocality. My name is Dr. Violeta Tsenova, and it is my pleasure to discuss this work that was conducted in collaboration with my colleagues Dr. Gavin and Professor Kirk. So in our paper, we discuss the design and the exhibition of Loci Stories, a networked interactive cabinet that plays video and audio stories to visitors at a heritage site in the UK. And by describing our design, we think through implications for polyvocal designs and use this to imagine future approaches when working with interactive displays in heritage settings. We're inspired by music theory and propose 4 textures for polyvocality. Those are monophony, homophony, polyphony, and cacophony. The underlying theory of our research is that of polyvocality, which is the presence of many voices or many perspectives as opposed to a single one. This idea originated in literature theory that challenged singular authorship and actually resonated with the critical heritage studies opposition to the authorized heritage discourse. The authorized discourse then is characterized by creating an authoritative and correct, typically exclusionary, although not always, narrative of heritage, and it champions unified and universal experiences of past and present. However, we know that heritage is a process, it's a performance through which we identify the values and memories and the cultural and social meanings that actually allow us to make sense of the present, of our identities, and of the sense of physical and social place. So polyvocality provides a framework of a pluralistic outlook on heritage, encompassing social, economic, political contexts that leads to the divergent experiences of being in the world. And since cultural venues are recognizing that they need to diversify their approaches to narrative representation, they have started adopting the idea of polyvocality. This has then led to quite a fruitful turn to exploring the theme of polyvocality in HCI and design literature. And here we are highlighting a couple of collaborations that came out in the recent years. And by reviewing them and building on what they've done, we are thinking even further how we might juxtapose the experiences, expectations, and interactions to help us discuss diverse narratives, and also how could the interactions foster engagement with the multiple perspectives. We then were inspired by this notion of literal voice, and we turned to voice interaction literature and to listening. So key for us here is making a distinction between attentive and holistic listening. So in heritage design, there is more focus on attentive, so that we understand that one specific narrative. And we still also focus on attentive listening, but we put it in this wider space of much more busy soundscapes that heritage sites have. We then also focus on the emotive qualities of the human voice, and we're also considering the difference between private and shared listening, so between audio guides and this idea of simulating a conversation. This then led us to our second and kind of key question, which is how might we use voice and listening to navigate between telling stories and experimenting with interaction modalities that foster polyvocality. We explored all of these questions by designing Loci Stories, and that's our networked and voice-activated storytelling cabinet. In the full paper, we outline the activities that led to the creation, but here we focus on its design. The design took place in the United Kingdom, in the northeast of England, with a 18th century property called Citadel Hall, and we collaborated with staff and volunteers to envision different interpretations and interventions that were inspired by contemporary art and forefronted the present-day experiences of those who work on site. So we created our conceptual direction, informing it by this literature and by the collaboration, and we identified 4 sensitizing concepts. That was to encourage engagement with the interactive display, to layer the voices, those that were heard in the stories, with the visitors' voices, also to listen harder. And here was about introducing interactions that encourage visitors to tune into the individual voices, so the individual stories, and to leverage the emotive language. And that was also used by our collaborators. The actual cabinet contains 3 low-cost and small form factor media PCs, and they were connected on a low-power private Wi-Fi network. So the application actually waits on the visitors to say a specific word on the specific computer, and audiences were prompted to say out loud one of two words. So, for example, discovery and morning on side 1, fire and muses on side 2, and memory and change on side 3. And using speech recognition, each of these words triggered then a specific story that was co-created with our collaborators. And audiences were also able to end videos by saying stop. And actually the use of these separate computers meant that we could play different videos and different ambient sounds simultaneously. Multiple visitors could stay around the cabinet and trigger the videos using their voice. And the network computers received all these events happening on the other computers. So including whether a sound is being played, whether a video had finished playing, and so on. So this meant that we could start other ambient audio on one machine that was being keyed by a video being played on another machine. And these all ambient sounds were not just random. They were also taken from the workshops in which our collaborators were discussing their experiences of heritage. And they also aimed to encourage visitors to walk around the cabinet and explore the different stories. So the display was exhibited for a month at Citandelible Hall in 2021. And over that month, we collected data via audience observations and also discussions in person and through an online survey for the visitors. We analyzed the data with a mix of deductive and inductive thematic analysis, shaping the themes based on what we knew about heritage theory and how we saw what we saw as responses to the interactions. I'll quickly go through the three main themes. So the first one is that the voice interaction facilitates a public performance. So we observed that based on how familiar or unfamiliar audiences were with voice interaction, they acted with the display in a different way. Some were more curious. Others were a little bit more apprehensive that they would create a cultural scene by speaking to this display. Then we also observed that digital installations can create useful juxtapositions, which meant that we could find ways to link the physical whole with interpretation in better ways, and that short bouts of information were preferred. They didn't distract from the rest of the experience. And overall, that by spreading out this network storytelling cabinets, maybe that could tie together the performative aspects of engaging with the place by looking for different stories, by engaging with them in different locations. And of course, our findings also affirmed that different stories speak to different people. And in many cases, the visitors were paying more attention to the content. They were commenting on their personal experiences, their own memories, as there were many local visitors, but also for those who weren't local, how they perceived the balance between historical facts and personal experiences as something that was igniting further curiosity. We took these findings and our understanding of the literature and looking for the synergies and points of crossover and dissonance between heritage and the visitors' engagement with our interactive display. And we came up with the 4 textures for polyvocality. In the full paper, we actually also critique our design through these textures, but here I'll just quickly present them. So monophony is a primary melody without a secondary melody or an accompaniment. And we link this to how typically authorized discourses of heritage mean that there is one accepted story that's presented. People would typically want to go and look for some historical, a certain clear historical narrative rather than a complex one. At the same time, there is homophony, which is a dominant melody accompanied by other chords in harmony. And we link this to how polyvocality is sometimes appropriated to introduce stories and perspectives that do not challenge and actually diversify the dominant narratives, but end up complementing them. So in the end, they can negate this idea of divergent heritage experiences. Polyphony, we already moved to this idea. Polyphony is composed of several independent parts, each forming a melody of its own right that can be listened to simultaneously or independently. So here we can think about polyvocality in terms of how independent and valid in their own right, but interlinked perspectives come together to create a more complex narrative. And in designing for polyvocality, we should be capturing these connections between historical perspectives and diverse experiences and how they interweave in the present. We think polyphony can help us do that. Cacophony, on the other side, tends to be seen as a mix of discordant sounds that create dissonance, and it's typically perceived as jarring or harsh. But similarly, the many different perspectives and stories can overlap, contradict, or affirm one another, and then creating a cacophony. And visitors may experience that dissonance. So that's in the literal sense of cacophony, especially in our case when we work with voice. But there is a potential in this idea of figurative cacophony, and the affordances to account for visitors' existing interaction vocabulary, actually, and create a cultural scene in which they could partake and navigate this busy soundscape. So, for example, when applying textures, we can imagine starting from the authorized discourses, allowing a plurality of diverse perspectives to speak over a monophony, and these perspectives could be presented as a polyphony to then become, again, a harsher cacophony and ease back into a more comprehensive narrative. So people may find listening to these many voices as in narratives difficult and perceive a cacophony of experiences, but others might perceive much busier narrative scapes. So we do think that textures can be used across these different components of designing: the aesthetic, the content, the interaction, the medium, the context. They're not separate. They need to be thought through. And actually designers can use their own practice to evaluate the texture of each element and then come up with new ways and new interactions that could present the stories that we're looking to be telling, and to create a textured landscape of polyvocality. Thank you.